focus the introduction. We've got a lot to cover and only about 30 minutes to get through it all. So I think we'll just dive straight into it, Barney, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So just some...
it's great to be here, by the way, so I appreciate the invitation from Affinity, so thank you very much.
So just the industry at a glance. Australia's education export earnings surged to a record 21.8 billion in 2016. I believe maybe a couple of billion higher than that. And income from education grew by 17%. That's in 2015. It's the strongest annual growth since 2010. And it's education of international students, Australia's third largest export, behind only iron ore and coal. Now, it seems to me, Barney, we've got two elements here to educating foreign students here in Australia. We've got the economic impact and we've got building relationships. Let's start first on the economic impact. It really can't be understated, can it?
No, you touched on it, Darren, when you mentioned it was Australia's third largest export industry. It's Australia's largest services export industry. And I think it's quite a remarkable story of success for this country when you consider at the moment both the Commonwealth and the federal opposition concerned about Australia's future economic growth, concerned about the resources sector and whether it will remain the strong driver of the Australian economy. You mentioned iron ore and coal sitting ahead of international education as export industries. Well, when the resources sector drops away, that has a profound effect on Australia's economic well-being. But yet over a period as short as 25 years, we've grown international education from virtually nothing to what is now $23–24 billion a year industry. So in that context, it's hugely important to this country in a range of ways. But just to put it, I think, in context for Sydney, as an example, it's about a $6.5 billion a year industry for Sydney. It involves over 70,000 international students studying in Sydney at the moment. And to put that in international context, New York has about 65,000 international students and London about 90,000 international students. So Sydney sits alongside the 2 or 3 most important centres in the world for international education. And that $6.5 billion drives a huge amount of employment and other economic benefits in Sydney alone. So economically, hugely important, but that brings with it a whole range of challenges in terms of maintaining that industry sector.
Well, are universities now dependent on this sector? I mean, it's obviously huge growth ahead, but is it something that we can't do without?
It's a good question. It's a particularly topical one at the moment because the Commonwealth, of course, is considering legislation that would reduce Commonwealth funding to Australia's universities. There's an efficiency dividend that's being considered by Minister Birmingham over the next 2 years. This is to take a total of about $2.5 billion of Commonwealth funding out of higher education. So at a time when the sector is under pressure in domestic terms, yes, this sector, international education, is critically important. And to put it in context, Australian universities have up to, on average, about 28% of our load, of our student load, is inbound international students. And that's a significant proportion of our total load. But some universities as high as 40% of their load is now international students. So it's an incredibly important part of the health of the sector, without a doubt. And of course, if there's a cut to domestic funding, that'll put more pressure on international education to deliver additional resources to compensate. One of the, I think, the really important aspects that we should keep in mind, the resources we bring in from international education, not only does it support our universities broadly, but in many cases, those resources are used to ensure that we maintain the world-class research activity that is so crucial to our international rankings and recognition around the world. So it's a very much interconnected system that we operate with, which is one of the reasons that we're certainly making it clear to the Commonwealth that they should think very carefully before cutting funding to higher education. I'm sure SBS makes similar comments, Darren, about funding to ABC and SBS.
Oh, absolutely, of course, let's not get into that. Has the government been receptive to your concerns?
Well, I think given the comments I've heard this morning that the Minister's made, no. The Minister's made some very strong comments about arguing that higher education needs to make its contribution to fiscal repair, budget repair in Australia. I think we would argue the counterpoint, which is that the data is overwhelmingly strong about the impact higher education and research has on the Australian economy, the impact it has on GDP, for example, about 10% of Australia's GDP, and that's a significant amount, is due to the additional productivity produced by graduates from Australian universities in the workforce. And then there's another considerable component, another 140 billion of GDP, which is directly attributable to the research effort of Australian universities over the last 40 years. So investment in universities brings economic benefit to the country. And that's just the economic end of the spectrum. I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence of the benefits of education to health and well-being, for example, that we could run through. So there are many reasons why investment in higher education is truly an investment, not a cost to the Commonwealth. It's, I think the arguments are clear. And at the moment, notwithstanding the strength of international education, there are a number of universities that would be under severe pressure if there was cuts to Commonwealth funding. So those arguments are before the Minister, and we hope that, that he will pay heed to them. But at the moment, it's not the case.
Well, talking about universities as an investment for the nation, for communities, your university, of course, Western Sydney, it's 9% of the Australian population living in Western Sydney, 44% of this city's population there alone, rapidly growing area. 42% of people in the region speak a language other than English at home. It's a very unique place for an institution such as yours to exist, isn't it?
It is, and we're a university governed by an act of the New South Wales State Parliament that makes it very clear that we have an obligation to provide higher education opportunities for our region. So we are very much driven by the need to engage with Western Sydney to provide access to higher education, to address educational disadvantage. We have, for example, about 25% of our students are from a low socioeconomic status background. We have similar figures, around 35% of our students, Australian students, speak a language other than English when they go home in the evenings. 65% of our students are first in family to study at university. And we're a very large Australian university with almost 45,000 students. So in that context, we have an extraordinarily important obligation to our region. And as you pointed out, Darren, it is a very diverse and rich region with many challenges. But I think at the moment we're seeing great opportunity in the region, and we need, as a university, not only to produce the graduates for the labour market of the future, but also to create the economic circumstances to the extent we can influence them in Western Sydney that ensures that we have jobs of the future in our region. I mean, one of the biggest challenges of Western Sydney, we don't need to drill down on this deeply, but 250,000 people a day leave Western Sydney to travel to the east to work. And that's a huge impact on people's lifestyles, on health and well-being, and on the congestion in our transport systems. We need to create jobs in Western Sydney. So our obligation is not simply, I think, to produce the graduates of the future, for the jobs of the future, and to work in that very rich multicultural community, but it's equally to change the economic circumstances, the new airport, infrastructure investment. We were talking about light rail, the museum developments, new stadium developments, all of these things happening. We need to ensure that the long-term economic benefits of that are jobs created in the West for the people of Western Sydney.
And the region being as diverse as it is, it's also a great responsibility of the university to try and bring these people together. And I mean, some of the amazing initiatives you've done, Muslim Harmony Reference Group, you've got going, you've got the Equity and Diversity Calendar. I mean, you must find that these are great tools for doing just that, for bringing people together.
Yeah, I think universities, and it's not simply Western Sydney University, these are important places for dialogue at many levels. And I think in the context of the communities that we serve and support, it's very, very important that we reach out to those communities. They're reflected in our student body in the way that we would be derelict in our duty if we didn't find opportunities to encourage dialogue, to encourage an opportunity for us to nurture the sort of social cohesion and harmony that's so important to enhance the learning experience of our students, but also to ensure that that experience is influential in the community. And you listed a number of the things that we're doing, and I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of the way our campuses right across Western Sydney respond to the communities that they support, and the way that our staff support those communities. We have very multicultural staff across the institution. So, and I think there's a growing recognition in Western Sydney that we need to take a very strong view of the opportunities the university can provide, the transformational nature that higher education can be to young people. I'm very proud, for example, of our refugee scholarship program that Peter commenced just a couple of years ago. We now have well over $2 million in our scholarship fund for refugees. And I'm very pleased with the way our staff have responded to that scheme. But it's just an example of where we take a leadership role as a university in Sydney and more broadly in Australia.
Well, on the refugee scholarship program, it's timely given that recent weeks have seen the government take action reducing the welfare payments to some refugees in the community, a small number, but your university has clearly identified this group as vulnerable and someone who we should be reaching out to rather than disqualifying.
It's very true. I think that last year, in fact, I think it was in 2015, we launched a new advertising campaign for the university as we rebranded ourselves. We made that subtle shift from being the University of Western Sydney to Western Sydney University. And a lot of people ask, why did you do that? And we're very proud of our region, so we moved the region to the front of our name. And we're very proud of the strength and the quality of our institution, so we rebranded accordingly. But when we were thinking about how do we tell the story of Western Sydney University, how do we get that story out there, we decided to tell the story through our alumni and through a number of our alumni. And the three that we chose, Melissa Chu, Jay Manley and Deng Adut, those particular short videos were released in 2015. And of course, Deng's resonated so powerfully at that moment. I'm sure everyone here has seen them. If you haven't, I think the Deng Adut video has been downloaded about 10 million times now. It's a huge viral success around the world. But if you remember, it was released at exactly the time that Europe was experiencing a surge of refugees from Syria and into Europe. And there was a great deal of concern about how Europe would respond to this humanitarian crisis. And we released the video on a Friday night, and when I woke up on the Monday morning, I had emails coming in about the fact that the video had gone viral, and it was on the front page of Reddit, which is one of the online news services. It pushed itself to the top, and I read the stream of comments that were coming in from all over the world, and many of them from Europe. And they had no idea who we were. They're asking, who is this university, Western Sydney University, and why is it that they can recognise the value that refugees can provide to the community, whereas there is so much negativity and challenge in Europe and around the world. So there was a very strong sense that the timing of this video was coinciding with a very important international debate, and certainly one in Europe, and it resonated strongly for that reason. Now, we fast forward to 2017, and just at the weekend, Deng attended a function at the university where he announced the first 3 scholarship recipients from his own foundation, the John Mack Foundation, named in honour of his brother, another refugee who fortunately was able to study with Western Sydney but tragically died when returning to South Sudan. But Deng is now giving back, and he spoke so passionately about how important the university was and how transformational it was. And then you look at the contribution he's made, and this is just one story about the contribution that refugees have made to this country, that we certainly have an obligation in the context of Western Sydney to do all we can to provide those opportunities, and we do it in a number of ways. The Refugee Scholarship Fund not only provides living allowances so that you take away some of that financial pressure, but we also, and a number of other universities are doing this now, provide opportunities where the visa classification of an individual means they can't access Australian government subsidies, that we provide fee waiver scholarships as well. And so we're very proud of that, and I think we're making a difference. It's not on the scale I think we need in Australia, so there's a great challenge there, but there's an enormous opportunity to change the lives of so many people who have suffered so much and so traumatically, and that they can make a profound difference to this country and internationally. And just the two young people who received awards at the weekend were talking about what a difference it's made to them to go and study at university, but importantly what they now want to do. A young Muslim woman who is very committed. She's doing a bachelor's degree in business and management, and she wants to be a business leader and make a difference to her community. And a young man with a tragic story. Father was taken prisoner by the Taliban in Afghanistan and died, unfortunately and tragically. Eventually he found his way to Australia. A civil engineer, loves Western Sydney, and he wants to go back and build bridges and rebuild the infrastructure of Afghanistan. And these are great stories. And these are incredibly talented young people. So I think our commitment is powerful and strong and will continue. I think the Australian government needs to think very carefully about how it supports
Definitely.
refugees.
Turning to international students now, we've got 22,000 courses in Australia across 1,100 institutions nationwide. Where does Western Sydney University sit in that? How many international students do you have? How many courses are you offering?
We have about 4,500 international students, so it's about 11% of our load is international. So when I gave you that data a little earlier, on the spectrum across Australia's universities, we are on the low side in terms of the proportion of total load that's international. When people come and attend our graduation ceremonies in Parramatta, Darren, one of the things they often say, and they sit in the audience, and they'll say to me afterwards, you have so many international students. And I say, no, Western Sydney is a very culturally diverse place, and you're seeing a whole lot of young people who are graduating, Australian young people graduating from such a rich cultural background. We give the impression of having large numbers of international students. We have large numbers of Australian students who were not born in Australia by the circumstances of and the nature of Western Sydney. And of course then we have second generation Australian students from backgrounds all over the world. So we're very proud of that diversity, but we only have about 11% of our load at the moment that is inbound international students. And that's something we're working on to grow that over the next few years. There's no doubt at all, there are 170 different ethnic communities in Western Sydney. So we feel that there's an opportunity for us to bring more international students to study with us in Western Sydney, and the quality of our facilities and our courses and programs, I think, are outstanding. So it's a great opportunity there. The reason the university doesn't have a higher proportion is that for a long period, the university focused very much on the communities of Western Sydney, so it was looking very much within the region. Now, as I say to our staff and students quite often, we don't do justice to our region now if we don't have global relevance, so we need to reach out internationally, bring more students in, also have more bilateral and multilateral relationships. So it's a different dimension now to our international outreach.
Reaching out, how important is it to make sure that you're attracting students from a broad range of countries and not focusing too much on any one particular country? And I bring this up within the context of a large influx, say, of students from China, for instance, and you have some courses, business courses, which will have upwards of 80 to 90% students international students from one particular country, making us somewhat dependent on that particular country. How important is it to make sure that you've got a variety of students from a variety of countries?
Look, I think getting balance across the portfolio of countries that a university is targeting for international student recruitment is very, very important. And you're right, I think at the moment there is some conversation going on about whether the balance in some institutions has shifted significantly, and there's certainly a surge at the moment of international students from China studying in Australia, particularly in business courses in some universities. And of course that's a very important part of the the opportunity for those institutions to build load and to generate resources. But by the same token, I think they're very acutely aware of the need to get some diversity into their student programs. The challenge here, of course, is an over-dependence in one market or in one country can certainly become a challenge if there's volatility. If, for example, circumstances change, and that can happen periodically. It has happened in Australia's history that for whatever reason, geopolitically or otherwise, we see a shift in where students from one particular country are studying. So that you can get that volatility. Clearly, the sensitivities around the South China Sea, sensitivities around China's relationship in the region, these do create circumstances where China could make a decision to perhaps not encourage as many students to come to Australia. So there's a vulnerability there. So I think it is important to have the diversity. Because we only have 11% of our load from international students inbound to Australia, we have that fairly spread across a number of countries. There's no dominant country. It's very strong, yes, from China, from India, from Nepal, from the Philippines, particularly into our nursing programs, but no single country dominates. And I think we're keen to build off that base. But for other universities, it's become a little more, a bit more challenging. And I think those universities are looking at how they diversify their student load.
You mentioned earlier that you are looking to attract more international students, and it seems one of the tactics you're employing is this downtown model, so to speak. Various CBD campuses, 9 I think you mentioned earlier today. We've got the new Parramatta CBD campus, we've got Bankstown, Liverpool underway. Is this an attempt to, I guess, in essence, future-proof what you do? I mean, it's really moving away from the typical one campus, one university model.
Yeah, no, there's a couple of things in this. We have made a decision, and we created our first vertical CBD campus. UTS, of course, is a wonderful example of a university that's thriving in a CBD location with Great Tower Building and others on their site on Broadway. But in the context of outer suburban universities around Australia and peri-urban institutions like Western Sydney and various other major cities in Australia and around the world, you see the same characteristics. We're often on land provided to us in suburban areas by governments in the 60s or 70s, and it's because it was available and cheap and government provided it. But if you look at the context of 2017, are those campuses in the right location? And the answer is probably not. There's a strong sense that we need to ensure, first of all, that we have connectivity to our region, that we are located in places where students can access higher education easily. Transport's a great challenge in Western Sydney, so from our perspective, Parramatta Square, which is the first of our new CBD locations, right beside a major transport hub, in a thriving, most important example of urban regeneration in Australia that's going on in Parramatta. This is a location where students can access higher education in state-of-the-art facilities with ease, and we want to build off that model. We've made a commitment to Liverpool as our next vertical campus. That will open early next year. And again, located beside the Westfield shopping complex at the end of the Macquarie Street Mall in Liverpool. And one of the other, before I talk about international students, one of the other great things you notice about that location, I was there the other day, there are thousands of people moving from the mall through to Westfield and backwards and forwards every day. And many young people, in particular, who don't believe higher education is for them. And we are very keen to have a building right next to them, which we believe will be the most technologically advanced teaching facility in Australia. And they'll walk past it every day, and we hope that it will inspire them to undertake higher education. So being in a CBD, you're much more visible to many of the young people that we are hoping to attract into higher education. We have made an announcement that we'll do a similar development in Bankstown. It's probably 3 or 4 years away, but again, it will be location close to transport, ease of access, and provide great opportunity in a region with educational disadvantage. And of course, I think many of our international students appreciate the benefits of being close to affordable housing, transport, CBD locations. I think UTS and Sydney UNSW exemplify that. They also love our traditional campuses, which will remain. We have a beautiful historic campus at Rydalmere with the female orphan school, so we have literally a campus with the oldest 3-storey building in Australia on it, dating from 1813 at the female orphan school on our Rydalmere campus. So we have great history and heritage. The same with our Hawkesbury campus, our Kingswood campus, and our Campbelltown campus. So we have, I think, a mixture of city locations, highly attractive, technologically advanced, part of the whole smart cities move. And at the same time, we have that great traditional set of campuses. So I think the balance is about right.
So we've spoken about students coming from overseas to Australia, studying at university, students, prospective students in Western Sydney, you're trying to lure in, of course, to education.
Mm-hmm.
The other element is sending students abroad in so-called mobility programs. What a great way to engage with our region, particularly given that you have such a multicultural tilt at the university too. So it must be a great advantage that you might, for example, be able to send someone of Chinese ancestry to China or likewise. Is that a great benefit?
Look, I think one of the great initiatives of the Abbott-Turnbull period with the federal government and Julie Bishop in particular as Foreign Minister was the establishment of the new Colombo Plan. And Julie Bishop, to her credit, began developing this concept before she was in government as opposition spokesperson prior to the last couple of elections. And she was very committed from her own personal experience to find opportunities for Australian students to have an international experience. We have benefited enormously as a country from bringing hundreds of thousands of international students to study here. These are students who make such an extraordinary decision. Often changing country is just one dimension of it. Language, culture, many changes they need to deal with, and yet they make this enormous life-changing decision to come and study in Australia. But Australian students have been remarkably reluctant to travel overseas. To give you a bit of data dating back about 3 years, across the Australian sector, about 12% of undergraduate students would have an international experience during their undergraduate study. For Western Sydney, it was about 2.4%. So our students were not only not taking those opportunities, they were doing so in significant numbers. So there was a real challenge for us, partly because of the circumstances of many of our students. They're working part-time, they have many other obligations that meant the chance for them to free up enough time to have an international experience for a semester was very limited. And financial reasons were a key part of that. New Colombo Plan provided an opportunity for on-scale in Australia encouragement of outbound mobility. And I'm pleased to say we've more than tripled the number of students going outbound from Western Sydney in the last 3 years. Some of it is for semester-long programs in Beijing, in Mumbai, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in Jakarta. These are great experiences for students to have overseas. Some of them involving a placement with an industry partner. That's another huge opportunity to advance their career prospects when they come back to Australia. Some of them doing a group short stay, 6 weeks in Xiamen in Fujian province, for example, at one of our partner universities. So there's a variety of ways that we're doing it, but crucially important, I think, to encourage more and more of our students in Western Sydney to reach out with an international experience in one form or another while they're studying, particularly into Asia. And you're right, there are those cultural heritage connections for individuals, but I think for all of our students, it's often life-changing. I hear them come back and I'm chatting to them about their experiences, and it's remarkable what they've got out of it and what they want to give back, and of course their desire to continue to travel. So I think it's a wonderful part of what we're seeing now. We're putting resources in as well as the Commonwealth to achieve this, so I think it's a great success story.
Well, the university also has a number of institutions which is connecting students, or which are connecting students and academics with institutions overseas doing collaborative research. One such is the Institute for Culture and Society. Is that one of the main vehicles through which you will be engaging with universities abroad and linking academics and students alike?
Look, I think one of the great things about Australian universities is that our academic staff are very connected. Our researchers are very connected internationally. You cannot be a successful academic researcher anywhere in the world, really, but certainly not in the Australian context, unless you have a good network that reaches internationally. So you're connected with your discipline, with the cutting-edge research that's going on around the world, and you're part of that, you're collaborating. One of the great things about, I think, Australian universities, we have a lot of international collaboration on publications, for example, and research publications and so on. So we're no different to that across the Australian system. And one of the really, I think, important aspects of international education and the international profile of Australian universities over the last 25 years is we have matured from being very focused on attracting inbound students to Australia to study, which is really important. But we've moved and matured to a much richer set of international relationships, mutually beneficial international relationships, bilateral relationships and multilateral relationships, so that our universities are very connected to partner institutions overseas, at an institution of institution level, even at an institution to government level, with various governments that are encouraging students to come and study in Australia and paying scholarships and wanting to connect with high quality universities overseas. And of course, at the level of our research centres like the Institute for Culture and Society and the relationships they have in the region. And so I think that's a very important aspect of the maturing of the Australian system, is now our relationships are not just about recruiting students in. We have outbound mobility now on scale, and we have rich research partnerships. We have a number of Australian universities with centres overseas. We have a campus in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, for example. There are many other universities with campuses overseas, many universities with joint research centres. Deakin University has very strong links into India, with industry partners in India. UTS has wonderful connections into China and joint research activity in China. So I think it's a great example of the maturing of the system and the fact that we now have a broad range of ways in which we can build international connection. And let's be frank about it, at this time in the world, I think it's vitally important that our universities are well connected internationally, that we are able to find ways to communicate and to support colleagues overseas during difficult times. And there are a number of those going on in the world, and university to university connections are vitally important. And I don't think there's anyone that would deny the hundreds of thousands of students that have studied in Australia and gone back to their countries over the course of the last 60 years since the original Colombo Plan began. That soft diplomacy is a critically important part of Australia's regional engagement. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that in many ways. If anything, the early phase of the Colombo Plan, those graduates who've gone back are now retiring. So there's a real sense of rebuilding and continuing to nurture those very strong connections in our region. So soft diplomacy is a critical part of it too.
I think that's a great juncture to move on to take some questions from the audience, I think, given